Norfolk, Virginia, Pier 12. Last week of July, 2026, USS Wasp LHD-1 takes on stores, ammunition, and 2,200 Marines from the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit across a 48-hour window that barely registers in the defense press. That same week, a Politico report lands citing Pentagon sources. Formal planning documents have been drafted outlining contingency options for Cuba, not war plans. Building blocks, the bureaucratic infrastructure of a plan. Read those two facts separately and neither amounts to much. Read them together, set them against the Baton ARG rotating the 22nd MEU, and trace two Arleigh Burke destroyers moving from 5th Fleet coverage in the Persian Gulf toward 4th Fleet's Atlantic and Caribbean zone, and something considerably more deliberate comes into focus. The question is not whether America is preparing to invade Cuba. It is not. The question is why the Pentagon is generating visible, readable artifacts of a Cuba contingency posture. Unit designations, loadouts, freedom of navigation patrols threading international waters at the edge of the Caribbean. With enough deliberate exposure that Havana reads the shipwake, Caracas reads the radar scope, and Beijing reads the carrier pier activity. Watch the E-2D Hawkeye climbing off the deck. That aircraft extends the carrier's eyes hundreds of miles into the Gulf approaches. That is a different kind of operation from a strike package. And by the time this analysis is finished, you will understand exactly who this signal is aimed at, and why the Caribbean just moved back onto the primary theater list for the first time since October 1962. Stay with this. The geography alone changes the entire calculation. To understand what is happening in the summer of 2026, you have to understand what 4th Fleet is. Most viewers of American military coverage have never heard of it. That is not an accident. 4th Fleet was deactivated in 1950 after the Second World War made Caribbean sea control a solved problem. It was reactivated in 2008, quietly, when the Pentagon began registering that the Western Hemisphere was no longer the strategic backwater it had assumed since the Cold War ended. 4th Fleet owns the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, Central America, and the waters around South America. Its reactivation was a signal. The problem is that a signal nobody reads does no work. This is the thing about military signaling that most analysis misses. A repositioning only functions as a message if the recipient can read it. The Politico reporting on Cuba contingency planning is not a leak in the traditional sense. It is a curated release. The Pentagon knows exactly which reporters have the sourcing on force posture. When defense officials brief that formal planning documents exist, they are not worried about operational security. They are printing a newspaper and making sure the right readers find it on their doorstep. If you want the strategy underneath the headline, not just the carrier arriving, but why that specific hull on that specific heading, subscribe. This channel exists for the gap between the ship you see on screen and the order that put it there. Now build the map. Cuba sits 90 miles from Key West, Florida. The Florida Strait, the body of water between the two, is one of the most strategically consequential narrow passages in the Western Hemisphere. It is the primary maritime corridor from the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic. Container traffic, energy shipments, and a significant share of U.S. coastal logistics move through that gap. During the Cold War, Soviet submarines operating from Cuban ports created a persistent detection problem for the U.S. Navy in its own backyard. That problem was eventually managed through a combination of pressure and arms control. What exists in Cuba today is different in character but similar in strategic implication. The Chinese ELINT facility at Bejucal, southwest of Havana, is not a new installation. It has been operating in some capacity since the Soviet era, with Chinese technical presence confirmed in open-source reporting from as early as 2023. By 2026, assessments of its capability have expanded. The facility is assessed to monitor U.S. military communications traffic from the eastern seaboard, intercept satellite downlink from Florida-based platforms, and provide persistent signals intelligence coverage of U.S. Southern Command's area of operations. The range from Bejucal to Miami is approximately 230 miles. The range from Bejucal to the naval station at Kings Bay, Georgia, home of the Atlantic SSBN fleet, is under 500 miles. That is inside comfortable ELINT collection range for modern ground-based systems. The Russian SIGINT facility at Lourdes, outside Havana, was formally closed in 2002 under an agreement with the Cuban government. Whether that closure was complete and whether access has been restored under the current strategic environment is one of the contested variables in the open-source literature. What is not contested is that the infrastructure existed and the strategic rationale for restoring it has only grown stronger as U.S.-Russia relations have deteriorated to levels not seen since the early 1980s. Set those two intelligence facilities against the backdrop of a collapsing Venezuelan interior. The Maduro government's effective control over the Venezuelan interior has been fragmenting since 2024. The Essequibo dispute with Guyana, the militia dynamics in the western states, the relationship between Caracas and Havana as both regimes face increasing internal pressure. These are not separate storylines. They are threads in the same fabric. Venezuela has served as the primary logistics node and financial lifeline for Cuba for 2 decades. As that line weakens, Havana's strategic options narrow. A Cuba under acute economic pressure with a weakening regional patron is a Cuba that might be more susceptible to a repositioning of the U.S. strategic perimeter. Or, read differently, a Cuba whose leadership might make unpredictable decisions precisely because its options are running out. Here is what the map looks like when you overlay the amphibious math. One amphibious ready group, one ARG, consists of 3 ships. Typically an LHD or LHA as the centerpiece, an LPD, and an LSD. It carries 1 Marine Expeditionary Unit of approximately 2,200 Marines with organic aviation, vehicles, and logistics. 1 ARG can conduct an amphibious assault on a lightly defended coastline, a non-combatant evacuation, a show of force entry, or a sustained raid. It cannot, on its own, conduct a forced entry against a defended shore against a peer or near-peer military. That requires more. Panama in 1989 involved approximately 27,000 American troops. The initial assault element that seized key objectives in the first hours was closer to 9,000. 3 ARGs operating in coordination, a force of roughly 6,600 Marines plus the Army and Air Force elements that would accompany any serious Caribbean contingency, gets you in the neighborhood of Panama scale. The Wasp ARG plus the Baton ARG represents 2 of those 3. The question of where a 3rd ARG would come from is answerable. The Iwo Jima, currently at Mayport, Florida, is the logical candidate. Its readiness status is not publicly confirmed, but its location is. The common version of events is wrong in one key detail. This is not being read in Havana first. The primary audience for this signal is not in Cuba at all. The audience is in Beijing. Here is what stands out about this particular strategic moment. The Monroe Doctrine has been invoked rhetorically for 200 years and enforced militarily perhaps a dozen times. What is happening in 2026 is not a rhetorical invocation. It is a bureaucratic and operational one. The Pentagon is not giving a speech. It is moving hulls, generating paper, and making sure the movement and the paper are visible. That is a different kind of Monroe Doctrine than anything the hemisphere has seen since 1962. And it is aimed at a different kind of adversary. China's strategic investment in Cuba is not primarily about Cuba. Bejucal is useful, but the real value of Chinese access in the Caribbean is what it does to U.S. strategic bandwidth. Every military planning session that has to account for a Caribbean contingency is a planning session not fully focused on the Pacific. Every ARG kept in the Atlantic for a Western Hemisphere deterrence posture is an ARG not in the South China Sea. Chinese strategic planners understand geographic portfolio theory. They have been running it in East Africa, in the Pacific Islands, in Central Asia. The Caribbean is one more node in a global access network designed to complicate American force projection by multiplying the number of theaters the Pentagon has to actively manage. What the United States is doing with the Wasp loadout, the Politico reporting, and the DDG repositioning is running that logic in reverse. It is saying the Western Hemisphere is not a free lane. You cannot deposit strategic pressure here and assume it costs nothing because American attention is on Taiwan and the South China Sea. The Caribbean has a price, and the price is American amphibious power parked at the top of the Florida Strait with its planning documents in the press. But there is a complication in this picture that the official framing does not address, and it changes the assessment significantly. The Cuban military is not the threat calculus driving this posture. Cuba's armed forces are conventionally weak, chronically under-resourced, and have not conducted a serious external military operation since Angola in the 1980s. An ARG plus MEU does not need to exist to deter Cuba militarily. What it needs to exist for is three things: to deter Chinese investment in Cuba's military infrastructure, to signal to Venezuela that the U.S. has options in the neighborhood, and to give the Guantanamo Bay installation, which remains the only American overseas base on a communist-governed island, a visible reinforcement backstop. Guantanamo's strategic value in 2026 is not primarily as a detention facility. That mission has been deliberately wound down over the preceding decade. Its value is basing. It sits on the southeastern tip of Cuba, separated from the rest of the island by a perimeter that has been continuously manned since 1903. The base controls the Windward Passage, the channel between Cuba and Haiti that is one of the critical maritime corridors connecting the Atlantic to the Caribbean Sea. Whoever controls the Windward Passage controls the eastern approach to the Panama Canal. Guantanamo, in that context, is not a relic. It is a geography that cannot be replicated by any other means. The strangest part of this analysis is not the carrier or the Marines. The strangest part is that the Pentagon has chosen to conduct this operation publicly. A classified contingency plan for Cuba would be standard procedure. Every combatant command maintains contingency plans for scenarios that are never expected to occur. Those plans exist, are updated, and are never discussed publicly. What is different here is the deliberate surfacing of the existence of these plans through official sourcing to reporters who cover the Pentagon. That is a choice. Choices at that level are not accidents. One detail keeps returning when you go through the structure of this reporting. The Politico piece does not describe the content of the Cuba planning documents. It describes their existence and their general character, formal building blocks for contingency options. That framing is precise in a way that suggests deliberate calibration. It conveys enough to be read as a signal by the intended audience while preserving enough ambiguity that it cannot be used as evidence of specific offensive intent. That is a diplomatic and strategic precision instrument, not a leak. Now consider the timing against the broader 2026 strategic environment. The United States in 2026 is managing simultaneous pressure in the Pacific. Taiwan's Strait tensions at a level not seen since the 1990s, a South China Sea where Chinese reclamation and militarization have moved several disputed features well past the point of reversibility, and a Korean peninsula where North Korean missile program milestones have continued to compress the warning time available to U.S. and allied forces. The Pentagon is, by any objective measure, stretched across more contested theaters than it has faced since the immediate post-Cold War period when it was simultaneously managing Iraq, the Balkans, and Korea. Against that backdrop, the decision to generate visible Caribbean pressure requires explanation. The explanation is not that the United States has suddenly found additional strategic bandwidth it did not have in 2025. The explanation is that the cost of not sending the signal has become higher than the cost of sending it. If the Chinese assessment is that the Western Hemisphere is a free strategic lane, that assessment will inform investment decisions in Cuba, Venezuela, and potentially Nicaragua and Panama that compound over time. The cost of correcting a mistaken Chinese assessment about Caribbean strategic latitude 5 years from now is considerably higher than the cost of generating a visible signal today. Here is the take that will probably get disagreement. The real target of this entire operation is not Beijing's military planners. It is Beijing's economic and infrastructure planners. The military planners already know the U.S. can project force into the Caribbean. What the infrastructure planners need to calculate is whether Chinese port investments in Venezuela, road projects in Nicaragua, and technical facility access in Cuba come with a geopolitical cost that makes them unattractive. A visible U.S. amphibious posture in the Caribbean changes the risk calculus for Chinese state-owned enterprises deciding whether to fund projects in the neighborhood. It makes the Monroe Doctrine relevant to a balance sheet, not just a military briefing. What do you think? Is the Monroe Doctrine a useful framework for 2026 great power competition? Or has the world moved past the logic of exclusive spheres of influence? Comment below. The people who run this channel read every response. Ask yourself, when you watch that flight deck running full operations at dawn, are you seeing a drill or a signal? The Venezuelan piece of this picture deserves more attention than it has received in the coverage of the Cuba contingency reporting. The Venezuelan interior collapse is not a humanitarian crisis that happens to have geopolitical dimensions. It is a geopolitical event that is producing a humanitarian crisis. The fragmentation of Caracas's effective control is restructuring the strategic map of northern South America in ways that are not yet fully legible. The Essequibo question, with Guyana sitting on newly proven offshore oil reserves of significant scale and Venezuela asserting historical sovereignty over more than two-thirds of Guyana's territory, has introduced a direct military threat vector into a neighborhood that had been relatively stable in interstate terms. American naval presence at 4th Fleet level, combined with SOUTHCOM's enhanced engagement with Guyana and Colombia, is part of a posture that addresses the Venezuela question even when the stated focus is Cuba. The La Guaira port, Venezuela's primary Caribbean port facility, sits 470 miles south of Guantanamo, within comfortable naval intercept range for a surface group operating from a Caribbean position. The route from La Guaira to Havana by sea runs through the Windward Passage. The same geography that makes Guantanamo valuable for Caribbean access control also makes it relevant to any scenario involving maritime traffic between Venezuela and Cuba. These are not independent variables. By the end of this breakdown, drop your call in the comments. Show of force or opening move? Will the U.S. formally activate a Cuba contingency planning process in a way that becomes publicly acknowledged within the next 18 months? Comment yes or no. The strategic trajectory makes this a genuine open question, not a rhetorical one. Now watch what the signal requires of its recipients, because the next image you see is not American. It is a Type 052D destroyer holding course on the open ocean horizon, its crew reading the same carrier deck operations you just watched. For Havana, the message is straightforward. The United States retains the capability, the will, and the geographic position to intervene in Cuba's security environment at a scale and speed that Cuban conventional forces cannot meaningfully contest. That message has been true for 60 years. What is new in 2026 is the decision to make it explicit and recent, tied to visible force movements rather than historical doctrine. Cuba's leadership has been managing the post-Soviet period by calibrating between economic necessity and ideological posture. The 2026 signal adds a variable to that calculation. The possibility that Chinese strategic investment in Cuba could activate American responses that are not in Havana's interest to absorb. For Caracas, the calculation is different. A Venezuela whose patron in Havana is under strategic pressure, whose own interior is fragmenting, and whose external patron in Beijing is conducting an investment risk recalculation is a Venezuela with fewer options than it had in 2024. The DDG repositioning from 5th to 4th Fleet is not aimed at Venezuela directly, but it is visible from Caracas in a way that affects the risk calculus of any escalatory move in the Essequibo or any decision to provide Cuba with military or logistical support that crosses a visible American threshold. For Beijing, the message is the most complex of the three. It operates on multiple levels. At the military level, it demonstrates that the United States maintains Caribbean primacy without compromising Pacific posture. The DDG repositioning is achieved through rebalancing within an existing theater, not by drawing from the Pacific. At the economic level, it raises the geopolitical cost of Chinese infrastructure investment in the Caribbean basin. At the strategic level, it signals that the United States is willing to manage multiple simultaneous pressure points rather than allow geographic diversification to dilute American responses. That last signal is the most important one. It is aimed directly at the Chinese strategic theory that American overextension creates usable lanes. One detail that stays with this analysis: the timing relative to the AUKUS implementation schedule. The Virginia-class submarine build rate acceleration, the UK/Australia submarine cooperation milestones, and the expanded EDCA site access in the Philippines are all unfolding on the same 2025 to 2027 timeline as the Caribbean repositioning. This is not a pivot to the Caribbean at the expense of the Pacific. It is a simultaneous posture expansion across multiple theaters, funded by a defense budget that has grown at real rates not seen since the post-9/11 period. The Caribbean move and the Pacific buildup are not alternatives. They are components of the same answer to the same Chinese strategic theory. So return to the question from the opening. Why did the Pentagon put Cuba invasion blocks on paper during the same 48-hour window that USS Wasp loaded 2,200 Marines at Norfolk? The paper and the loadout are the same operation. One creates the visible artifact in the media environment. The other creates the visible artifact in the satellite environment. Both are designed to be read by the same audience. Neither requires a shot to be fired. Neither requires a Marine to set foot on Cuban soil. The entire operation is informational, and it is aimed not at changing what Cuba does, but at changing what China calculates about the cost of operating in Cuba. The Monroe Doctrine in its original 1823 formulation was a speech, a diplomatic document aimed at European powers considering recolonization of the Western Hemisphere. America in 1823 had no navy capable of enforcing it. It was a statement of intent backed by geographic isolation and British naval power that had its own reasons to prefer an open Caribbean. What is happening in 2026 is the same doctrine, updated for a world in which the enforcer has 11 carrier strike groups, 3 deployable ARGs in the Atlantic Basin, a base at the eastern tip of Cuba, and the ability to generate visible force movements in a 48-hour window. The doctrine has always been written in the language of power. The language has simply changed from diplomatic notes to ARG hull numbers. The board as it stands, the United States has demonstrated that Caribbean primacy is an active posture, not an assumption. China's ELINT access at Bejucal continues uninterrupted. The Russian question at Lourdes remains unresolved. The Venezuelan interior continues to fragment. The Wasp will complete its loadout, and the planning documents will remain in the press. Whether Havana's calculus shifts in response to the signal, whether Beijing adjusts its Caribbean investment risk model, and whether the Bataan and Iwo Jima ARGs eventually join Wasp in a configuration that moves past visible signaling toward active contingency rehearsal, those questions remain open. What is not open is the geographic logic. The Florida Strait is 90 miles wide. Guantanamo controls the Windward Passage. The Caribbean sits inside the first-order defense perimeter of the continental United States. That geometry has not changed since 1823. What changed in July 2026 is that the Pentagon decided the Caribbean needed to be reminded of that geometry in a way that the satellite and the press could both document. The Monroe Doctrine was never a peace treaty. It was a range card, and the men who enforce it today fly off angled flight decks, launch from carrier islands, and hold periscope depth inside straits that no rival navy crosses unchallenged.